Hi, this is AP Macroeconomics 2015, question number 1. As always, if you haven't already attempted this question yourself, please do that first. If you are unsatisfied with my explanation, please let me know. And if you have other questions you'd like me to try to explain for you, please let me know as well. I'm happy to do so. So this is 1B. I just want to review a few things quickly. The first is B. Federal funds rate. Again, this is the rate at which banks lend money to each other. If we would like banks to do more lending to each other and banks to do more lending to people in general to stimulate or facilitate economic activity, we typically would want a lower federal funds rate. And a lower federal funds rate would encourage more lending, more money supply, more spending, lower interest rates, all of which would help us, maybe, in theory, to reach full employment. For D, policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. In part B, assume that marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is 300 billion. So the first thing, if we have our MPC, if MPC is 0.8, we know that MPS is 0.2 because these two things need to add up to 1. And we also know that the value of the spending multiplier is 1 divided by 0.2, or 5. So we know what the multiplier is, we know how big the gap is, we know how big the gap is that needs to be closed. The question is, what can we spend when multiplied by 5 equals 300 billion? And if you solve for x equals 60. So 60 billion needs to be spent when combined with the magic of the money multiplier, or the spending multiplier, will result in a closing of this $300 billion recessionary gap. And this, I would recommend showing your work for D(i)(1). Now, the taxes, so they're asking if they decide to do something with taxes instead of government spending, how can they also close the recessionary gap? And now they're not, despite it saying explained, you don't have to do the numerical calculation. You do need to remember that the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier, and you do need to provide evidence of that. So actually calculate the tax multiplier, compare it to the size of the spending multiplier, and in this case we know that the spending multiplier is 5, so the tax multiplier is 4. Negative MPC over MPS, so it'd be 0.8 over 0.2 equals 4. And just showing your calculation of the tax multiplier and the spending multiplier would be enough to show that the tax multiplier is smaller. And then the theory why it's smaller is that any change in taxes, so any money that people have, extra money people now have, disposable income people now have, as a result of a reduction in taxes, first has to go through their consumption function. And the consumption function is, if you remember the Doges, we will spend a portion of the money we have, and we will save a portion of the money we have. So this is the MPC and the MPS. And the portion we save means that we will not spend the full amount, which means it will take more time in order to get the full cumulative effect. The taxes and the tax multiplier will always be smaller than the spending multiplier because it needs to go through the consumption function first. All right, the last thing, and this is actually kind of interesting because the AP gives you a choice. So again, this one, increase, decrease, stay the same. But if you go to the mark scheme, scoring guidelines, which is pretty remarkable, they actually give you 3 possibilities for correct answers. So stay the same, increase, decrease, and provided you justify your answer, you could justify each of these. You could justify why it'll stay the same, you could justify why it will increase, and you could justify why it will decrease. Frankly, I don't, personally, as your teacher, I don't necessarily agree with this as much, so I would try to avoid that, just because it's a little bit cumbersome and it's not congruent with most of the other explanations that the AP requires. The increase argument, again, it's the savings, leads to more IG, leads to more capital formation, leads to more growth, which you're familiar with from other questions. And then the last one point is earned for stating that LRAS will decrease in the long run because lowering taxes leads to a crowding out of private investment. So in this, gets back to the budget. So again, taxes are positive, they are inflows. Government spending is negative, it's an outflow. And in a situation where G is bigger than taxes, the government will need to borrow money in order to accomplish its spending plan. So if we lower taxes and we keep government spending the same, we're likely to experience a deficit, which means a demand in loanable funds will shift to the right, causing an increase in the real interest rate, which, if you recall, the crowding out effect caused IG to be less than it otherwise would be because money is now more expensive to borrow. So there's an argument there for LRAS decreasing in the long run. I would say these are probably the best two explanations to go with, but it is somewhat refreshing to see the AP accept more than one option as being appropriate for the answer.